It's a great honor for me to introduce you, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, Bill Clinton.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you, Willem, for the introduction and for inviting me here to give this address. Minister Blaker, Mayor von Strohe, citizens of Achlum, other public officials, you're all drowning in the Ret, and I think it is wonderful that this great company has come back to its roots to celebrate 200 years of success. I am honored to be invited to speak here because I love the Netherlands. And I think it's wonderful that you're spending all these days talking about social solidarity. I suppose if I were really interested in social solidarity, I would say the solidarity thing to do is to let you come in out of the rain. But I'd like to say a few things seriously. First of all, I am, as an American and a former president, very grateful for the friendship and the partnership our two nations have enjoyed. I am grateful that the Netherlands is the third largest investor of all nations in the world in the United States. I am grateful for the extraordinary military cooperation and leadership of the Netherlands and NATO, especially 15 years ago in the horrible conflict in Bosnia. And I suspect that the people who are part of that here are as grateful as I am that Mr. Mladic was finally captured and will be brought to justice for all the innocent people that he killed. I am grateful for the support of your unique Dutch postcode lottery in the work I do against climate change and to fight the AIDS epidemic around the world. I'm thankful for that. But mostly, I want to talk about the fact that you decided to dedicate this 200th anniversary to the study of solidarity in the Netherlands and what it means for the 21st century. 200 years ago, 39 farmers gathered in this village to organize themselves to ensure together against the hazard of fire. You might be interested to know that about 235 years ago, the very first NGO in the United States of America was a volunteer fire department organized by our founding father, Benjamin Franklin, in the city of Philadelphia. So we have a lot in common. But think about this. In the beginning, what happened was a cooperative and looked more like an NGO than a company. Because at the time, no city government could afford to field a fire department. At the time, there were no building standards to build fire-resistant buildings and little capacity to do it. And at the time, there was no money in insuring people against fire because once the house or the barn burned down, nobody had any money to pay. And so people banded together. That is very important because one of the great unresolved questions of the 21st century in every country in the world is how to resolve tensions between what individuals and individual businesses want to do and what is best for the society as a whole, and whether there has to be a conflict. How do you have universal freedoms and accommodate social, religious, racial, and ethnic diversity? A challenge you face, a challenge we face. So I will attempt, because of the weather, to tell you what I think as briefly as I can. Willem was going to ask me 10 questions. We decided 2 would do. But I think it's important. It's important because of the current state of political life in the Netherlands and in Europe, because of the debate that you're having now about what the EU should do and the Eurozone should do, about Greece and Portugal and others. It's important to discuss what is the 21st century meaning of social solidarity within a country, within a continent, across the globe. I think you have to answer 4 questions. First of all, what is the fundamental nature of our time? Second, what is your vision for the world you wish to leave to your children? Third, how do you realize it? And fourth, who is supposed to do it? Now, if it weren't raining and the sun were shining and I got 20 questions or 50 questions, every single answer I would filter through the framework by which I answer those 4 questions. The fundamental nature of the 21st century is that it is the most interdependent age in history, and not just because of economics. Indeed, the wealthiest countries in the world were slightly more trade dependent as a percentage of GDP before World War I than they are today. But there was not as much travel, money didn't cross national borders as rapidly, and there was certainly no internet, where now a 10-year-old child anywhere in the world can get on the internet and learn in 30 seconds things I had to go to university to learn. It is an amazing time. It is a time of staggering scientific discovery, much of it due to cooperative endeavors. For example, we learned in the last year, thanks to the Hubble Space Telescope, that there is a planet in the constellation Libra beyond our solar system, which may be far enough away from its sun to have conditions almost identical to Earth to accommodate life. Now, if there were life on another planet, that would guarantee solidarity across the globe. Because historically, solidarity has come to organize against something: national security, a conflict, or a fire. The Human Genome Project, which was completed in the basic sequencing in my last year as president, was a global project of cooperation. We have learned a lot of interesting things, some of them rather humorous. Just in the last few months, we learned that all people on Earth who are not 100% descendant from sub-Saharan Africans, everybody else has between 1% and 4% of their genome inherited from our pre-human ancestors, the Neanderthals. Now, I don't know about here, but in America, if you call someone a Neanderthal, it's like saying they're big, clumsy, rough, boorish. My wife and daughter were not at all surprised to learn that I was part Neanderthal. They were, however, stunned to learn that they were part Neanderthal, because we shared the earth with Neanderthals for 40,000 years. They were bigger and stronger than we were. Their brains were about the same size, but they never learned to speak as we did, or to draw. And eventually, we probably survived and they didn't, because we could run and they couldn't. Then, to me, the most interesting thing that's happened in the area of cooperative science was a study that came first out of the United States and will be confirmed or contradicted later this year by the multinational Hadron Superconducting Supercollider, which is in Switzerland near the French border, which is the fastest mechanism in the world for crashing atoms against one another, breaking them up, and measuring what happens to the subatomic particle. But the American machine, which is not quite as fast, picked up something about subatomic particles called muons. Always before, in classical physics, people had assumed that the positively charged and the negatively charged subatomic muons were in equal balance. And that's what enabled matter to hold together. That's what kept our bodies from flying apart. This experiment showed that by ever so little, the positive muons outweighed the negative ones. And I thought, thank God, I can be an optimist. Seriously, what scientists believe is that it might allow us for the first time in history to unify the disciplines of biology, chemistry, and physics. And it might explain how life emerged from the primordial slime to all of us being in this venue today. It's an exciting time to be alive. But there are three big problems with the world we live in. First, it is entirely too unequal within many countries and across national borders. I spend most of my time working in poor countries today. Half the world's people are still living on about $2 a day. 1 billion people go to bed hungry every night. 1 billion people have no access to clean water. 2.5 billion people have no access to sanitation. 1/4 of all the deaths on Earth, including those from natural disasters, accidents, crime, war, cancer, heart attack, stroke, 1/4 of all the deaths on Earth this year will be from AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and infections from dirty water, the diseases of the poor. The second problem with the world is it's too unstable. Look how fast the financial crisis spread from the United States to the UK to Ireland, and then pretty soon China had 35 million unemployed factory workers because Europeans and Americans couldn't buy their products anymore. Look at the worries we have about transnational impact of terrorist operations. Look at the controversy about the U.S. operation against Osama bin Laden. It's all part of living in a world where borders look more like nets than walls. The world is unstable in other ways. We worry about diseases spreading across national borders. The regions are unstable. Look at what's going on in the Middle East. It may turn out great, but it's uncertain now. A certain amount of instability is necessary in life. It's the space for creativity and risk and moving forward. But too much causes people to shut down and become defensive and to look at people who are different from them in a negative way. And the final problem the world has is it's unsustainable because of climate change. I know it's hard to convince you here, it's almost June, but global warming is real. I wish we had more of it right now, but it is real. And I'll just give you the latest evidence we have. This spring, the plants in the Arctic Circle bloomed 15 days earlier than normal. Oh, it's exciting. In a couple of years, you'll be able to take a ship across the North Pole. But at the same time, the ice cap on Greenland is melting. That's 8% of the world's fresh water. If it all flows into the North Atlantic and blocks the Gulf Stream, then Northern Europe, including some of the most productive economies in the world in Scandinavia, could become as cold as it was 700 years ago, with very bad consequences for this entire continent and for the world. So, that's my first answer. The world is more interdependent than ever. There's a lot of good, there's a lot of bad. Therefore, what kind of world do I want? Second question. I want a world of shared responsibility, shared opportunity, a shared sense of community, where we drastically reduce the negative and accelerate the positive forces of our interdependence. You need an answer like that. If you don't like my answer, you need your own. Third question, how do you get such a world? Well, first, the world is still organized around nation states. And I think it's important to recognize that the challenge of achieving more positive and less negative interdependence is very different in a poor place than a wealthy one. One of the major efforts that I undertake now is trying to help rebuild Haiti after the earthquake. And I work all over Africa and Southeast Asia and poor countries in Latin America on building healthcare systems and economic systems. The problem in poor countries is they don't have systems. You think about it, there are many different life stories in this crowd today. And many of you had more difficulty getting into these seats over the course of your life than others. But every one of us, at critical junctures in our lives, had food to eat, a place to sleep, clean water to drink. We had a way to get an education. Someone gave us a way to make a living. That's how we got here. I spend a lot of my life in places where people can take none of that for granted. In Haiti, before the earthquake, 2/3 of the people lived on less than $2 a day. 85% of the people had no electricity in their homes. Half of the children never went to school. Half of the others went to school where they had to pay tuition even though they were too poor to afford it, which explains why 200,000 children in a country of only 9 million were sold into indentured bondage by their families for a little bit of money so they'd have fewer mouths to feed and they could feed and educate the ones who were left. Those places need systems. What do systems do? They make good conduct predictable in its results. They give people an orderly way to progress through life and societies a way to rise. So I spend most of my life today building systems. The problems in wealthy countries are different. We all have systems, that's how we got here. And they've been pretty good to most of us. But in every country, and this goes in every civilization, you can go all the way back to the Sumerian. What happens is that as a country or a civilization ages, the systems atrophy. They need to reform and they resist it. And the resistance comes from two places. First of all, the people running the various systems become more interested in preserving their position and their prerogatives than advancing the purposes for which the institutions were established in the first place. And second, the people who benefit from the present are more interested in holding on to the present than creating the future. That's the challenge America faces today with our budget deficit, with our finance system, with our manufacturing system, with our energy system. All of our systems need reform. And every time you try to change something, there's someone who's against it, either because they're trying to hold on to what they have at the top of it, or because they're trying to hold on to the benefits of the status quo, even though it's robbing us of a brighter future. So that's what we have to think about. So the fourth question is, if you have to build systems or reform them, who's supposed to do it? And this is the social solidarity answer. We all are. There is no successful country in the world today that does not have both a growing economy and a good government. And increasingly, more and more non-governmental organizations. You need a growing economy for obvious reasons. You need a good government because there are some things that the market will not price, and some problems the market will not fix. There are people who are disabled or otherwise unable to support themselves. There are projects which cost so much money that no individual company or sector can aggregate the capital necessary to their investment. If you do it, you're rewarded. If you don't get the benefits. China has more cash than anybody in the world. They just re-engineered a rapid train that they brought to China for the Olympics that now goes 306 miles an hour, almost 100 miles faster than the fastest trains in France and Japan. You need governments to guarantee the public health and clean air and clean water, and to organize responsible, economically practical responses to climate change. If you have good governments, it's amazing how fast good things can happen. I'll give you an example of two radically different ones. In November of last year, I went to Vietnam to celebrate the 15th anniversary of the normalization between the United States and Vietnam, which happened when I was president. We fought a terrible war against one another, and now we don't have a better ally in Southeast Asia. In 1995, when we normalized relations, their income was only $300 US per year. 15 years later, $1,500, went up 5 times. In 1998, I took the first of many trips to Rwanda, where 10% of the country was killed in 90 days in 1994. Their income was still $268 a year, less than $1 a day, 4 years after the genocide. In 2010, it was $1,100 a year, because they're well organized, because they welcome private investment, and they welcome NGOs, and they have a government that can perform the basic functions that are needed. Now, I say that because I think it's important to focus on it. In advanced countries, we have to worry about being complacent and spending too much time fighting and too little time doing. I just came back from Brazil, which has problems on both sides. Brazil, China, and India have the problems of rich countries and the problems of poor countries. They have systems to reform and systems to build. But Brazil has an interesting problem, a high-class problem if you're interested in doing something about climate change. More than 90% of their electricity comes from renewable resources. And they produce 20% of all the oxygen on Earth in the Amazon rainforest, not coming from the oceans. So they're growing like crazy, and they want to keep producing clean electricity. Their easiest way is hydroelectric power. The problem is the only rivers running fast and strong enough now are in the rainforest. And the biggest proposed dam would literally end a thousands-of-year-old Indian culture in the rainforest. Now, they have to decide what to do about it. But the interesting thing to me is, for 2 years in a row, I have been invited to Brazil to talk to people about it, and all of the stakeholders were there. So instead of having a fight, you had the head of all the oil companies, the head of all the electric companies, the leader of the Green Party, who ran third in the race for president of Brazil, people representing the indigenous people, and people representing all the alternative energy sources. That's what we have to do. A lot of these problems require thinking and working together. So, the last point I want to make is non-governmental organizations can play a big role in that. NGOs have always been necessary to do what was done by the 39 farmers in the cooperative here 200 years ago, to step into the gap between what the private sector can produce and the government can provide. But increasingly today they're important because they are uniquely situated to answer the most important question of the 21st century, which is whatever you propose to do and however much money you're putting into it, how do you propose to do it? The how question is the most important question. And an NGO, unlike the private sector, doesn't have to turn a profit. They just have to be accountable and transparent for how they spend their money. And unlike the government, you don't have to worry so much about failure and getting a bad story in the press. I fail all the time now, and I work on trying to double or triple or quadruple agricultural productivity in Africa and Latin America, and finding ways to have sustainable healthcare systems in places like Ethiopia, where all the cities have good health care, but 60% of the people live in more than 60,000 villages with fewer than 1,000 people, and there were only 700 clinics in the entire country when we started working. And so when we fail, we just say, hey, we tried this, we failed, it didn't work, now we're going to do something else. So I can't say what Dutch social solidarity should look like in the 21st century. I can't tell you how to resolve your immigration issues. I can say this. Japan is going to be given a terrible challenge because of this earthquake and tsunami. They were, until about 15 years ago, the #1 nation in the world in the use of solar panels. Then they were lapped by the U.S., then the U.S. and Japan were lapped by Germany. Now China produces more but uses less. They are a very great country and a very remarkable people. But they have tried to secure solidarity through ethnic cohesion, and they don't have much immigration. So they have the reverse problem of that, which causes all the controversy in the Netherlands and the U.S. And now they're too old, and they don't have enough young people to power their economy and to grow. And in all the places where the population is growing fastest, they're not wealthy enough to support their people. So, because once you put all the girls in the world in school, and once you give all young women access to all jobs, they delay the age of marriage, they delay the age of first childbearing, and you get control of the population. It's the one thing you can do that works in every culture across all religions, across all regions. But it slows the birth rate, and in Japan they have not enough. So what I have to say is simply this. Every society has to define for itself how you can create a society of shared opportunities and shared responsibilities, where the only people who feel entitled are those who are getting something back they've already invested in, or those who through no fault of their own can't support themselves. In order to build that kind of society, you have to have a sense of community where there is enough trust to change. Change requires trust. Countries are like individuals. The older you get, the harder it is to change. I had a wonderful member of my cabinet when I was president, who's been my friend for 20 years before we started working together in Washington. And he used to have this great saying. In every cabinet meeting when we had an argument, he would say, "Let's change. You go first." We have no choice. We are not coming to grips with the fundamental challenges of the world at a fast enough pace to give our children and grandchildren the world that gave us the lives that brought us to this place today. And I would just say this, something serious about the Human Genome Project. From a social point of view, by far the most important finding is that every non-age-related difference you can see in this audience, every one, your gender, your hair color, your eye color, the shape of your bodies, everything unrelated to AIDS is the result of only somewhere between 0.5% and 0.1% of your human makeup. We are, in other words, 99.5% the same. And yet, the world is awash in troubles because we spend 99.5% of our time thinking about the 0.5% that is different. And so, and look, I like our differences. Our differences make life more interesting. But we have to identify what we have in common. The king of Jordan, King Abdullah, the son of the late King Hussein, who was a great friend and collaborator of mine, has written an amazing autobiography which contains the effort he made in the last few years to bring the major schools of Islamic thought together to hammer out common principles, because they have no doctrine like the Catholic Church and other churches. There are no dominant authorities even within sectors of thought as Judaism has and other faiths have. And he is a vociferous opponent of violence and terrorism. He did a great thing. And he's been trying to get it more widely disseminated and discussed ever since. But I thought about coming to the Netherlands when I got his book and I read it, and all the controversies you've had here, we've had in the United States. We just had a young Pakistani who got 2 college degrees in America, married a Pakistani Muslim woman who got a college degree in America. He lost his job and lost his home in the economic meltdown, went home, went to the uncharted territories, learned how to make a bomb, and tried to set it off in Times Square. And I thank God he didn't learn his lesson very well. So he failed. But we have got to find a way to share the future, because we are going to share it one way or the other. The borders of the world are more like nets than walls. We cannot get away from each other. We have to reduce the inequality and increase the opportunity. We have to reduce the instability and increase the responsibility. We have to reduce the unsustainability of climate change, and I believe that it'll generate more jobs than ever before. And we have to find a way for every private citizen to do public good. I don't think there's a better example of that than the Dutch postcode lottery. Now, I'll make full disclosure here. At my global initiative, which brings together people from all over the world every year, they first made the commitment to give all the people who bought lottery tickets LED lights. Seems like a little thing, doesn't it? It's responsible for reducing your emissions by 73,000 tons a year. Just giving all the people who bought lottery tickets LED lights. They finance a lot of what I do in AIDS in Swaziland and in Nigeria. And they support my climate change work, which includes working with the Netherlands on this carbon capture project you have. But we can all do something. The tsunami, where I worked for 2 years in South Asia for the UN, was the first major disaster that was largely financed by internet contributions by people of modest means. In America, half the people who gave money gave it over the internet, and the median contribution was $56. When the earthquake hit Haiti, we gave the same amount of money, but the median contribution was lower because people could finance their giving over the cell phone with a text. They typed in Haiti the number and they gave money to the fund I set up with former President Bush or the Red Cross or some other fund. There is something for all of us to do. You will have to find a uniquely Dutch answer to the definition of solidarity. But I'm convinced that all successful countries will do it, first with a good economy, a good government, and vibrant NGOs. Second, by answering the how question. And third, by understanding that our differences are important, but our common humanity matters much, much more. Thank you, and good luck.
Maybe it's more convenient to stay here.
Thank you.
Okay, I would first like to say thank you very much for your speech so far, but we had the opportunity to collect some questions today which we would like to ask to you. I had a few of myself also. We will just see how it goes, and as long as everybody knows there is no rain anymore, so we will continue. And the sun will be shining in a few minutes then. So that's what was promised by Piet Paulusma today. First of all, it's the famous weather forecaster. First of all, Mr. President, a few questions on, or at least one on healthcare in the Netherlands. You see probably also in the United States that healthcare is becoming more and more expensive, particularly because of the aging population. You could imagine that governments should be able to impose mandatory health promotion measures to have people more healthy. What's your opinion on this?
Well, first of all, I think You have a high-class problem here because you've managed to have a private system that has a real budget, so you spend less than 10% of your income on health care. All the European countries spend somewhere between 9 and 10.5. Switzerland's at 11.5 because it's an older population with the delivery system's expensive because people live in all those alpine villages. The U.S. spends 17.2% of its income on health care. So you shouldn't worry. Right now you have a competitive system. It will cost you more as people get older because, as those of us who are older will tell you, things stop working. There's nothing you can do about it. I work out, I try to stay healthy. I think what would have the biggest impact is if you could have some sort of differential pricing, some sort of incentive for good, healthy behavior. I don't think you can basically order people to have good habits, but I think you can reward them if they do. And if you do that, I think you will maximize your potential. But right now, even though it's more expensive for you, the main thing you don't want to do is get in the position we're in, where we went the last decade. When I was president, we kept health expenditures in line with inflation, but I couldn't cover everybody, so I couldn't get it down. Then it exploded in the last decade, and so before the economic meltdown, our incomes adjusted for inflation, median family income, was lower than it was the day I left office 8 years earlier. This can become a terrible problem. So you can't let it get much over, as long as you're bumping around between 9 and 11%, you can live with that. And my advice is, before you get into mandatory practices, which people will ignore if they can, it's much better to give people an incentive to do the right thing and make sure the children are healthy. Make sure you have the minimum exposure to what is gripping the US, the UK, India, and China, which is lower income working people moving to cities, working like crazy, eating more fast food, less healthy food. Schools are under pressure and they don't give the same physical education, so you have growing obesity among young people and exploding diabetes among younger adults. That's the problem we have in America today. That's what you don't want. That's the thing that will drive your prices up. You can't stop it from getting a little more expensive as a society ages. But the main thing to remember is this. I turned 65 this year. I'm the oldest of the post-World War II generation. When we all die off in about 20 years, the next generation of older people are not as numerous as their children. So this will right itself. You just need to get yourself through the next 20 years with the most sensible system you can.
Thank you very much. A quite different question is on what you talked already about was your initiatives on microfinance. As we stand here in Achlum 200 years ago, the initiative, you could define it as microinsurance as we look at it from today. What's your point of view if we want to have more microfinance initiatives in the developing world? What should be done?
Well, I think first of all, we need microfinance and we need microinsurance, and I personally believe to make them sustainable, they should be profitable. That is, the best microfinance programs charge a reasonable interest rate and they make money because poor people basically all over the world have a repayment rate of between 96 and 98%. And they have no financial statements. They get loans based on their reputation in the community and the skills they have. And they also need access to insurance. So more and more we're seeing that. Particularly, for example, if you have someone who's HIV positive and we moved in, we give them medicine, they'll probably have a normal life. But if they have 3 or 4 children and the government has no social programs to support them, it'd be good if they had a modest insurance program so their children could at least reach adulthood with meals and access to education. So I think there's money there to be made. And I think they have to be set up as money-making institutions, although not on the scale that you make money now, but they should be set up to be sustainable. Second thing I would say is microcredit is important, but it's not enough. For example, in Haiti, We have pretty good networks of microcredit. But before we started this work, there were no loan facilities above microcredit, modest small business loans, because the banks made all their money taking Haitians who live overseas money and they send it back to Haiti, then they charge a big fee to convert it into Haitian currency and to hold the money. 20% of Haiti's GDP comes from Haitians abroad sending money home. So we have set up, President Bush and I have set up this small business loan fund and a mortgage fund in cooperation with Canadian gentleman Frank Justra and Carlos Slim, the Mexican billionaire. We put together probably $45 million to have home mortgages for the first time and small business loans. So what you have to do is not stop at microcredit. You have to find a sustainable way to go a little bit above that, even in the poorest countries.
Thank you very much. I will ask a final question, and then afterwards I will close this big event. The final question, of course, is about solidarity. That's where this convention is all about. We see that research shows that support for solidarity is declining, and ignorance plays quite often a big part of it. It's often difficult to have people realize their self-interest in collective measures. How do you feel we can change this feeling?
Well, first of all, support for solidarity declines as insecurity increases. And Europe has been through a tough spell with this economic crisis. Even though your unemployment rate is half ours, even the countries with responsible banking systems do. And then when people are insecure about the future, they're afraid of being taken advantage of. I read some of the Dutch press before I came here, and all the people saying, well, we don't want to give Greece any more money, they won't be able to pay it back. Here's what happened with Greece. First of all, they always have had budget problems, but you knew that when you let them in the euro. There's a fundamental difference. Here's the problem with the euro, and I supported it. You can let poorer countries into the European Union and they can carry their load. If they join the common currency and their incomes are much lower, it'll be a great thing for them and a good thing for you as long as the economy is growing. When the economy turns down, it just kills the poor countries because you don't have complete economic and social unity yet. So, for example, our poorest states in the U.S., they got all these national transfers during this recession, and it was tough for them because they were poor, but they survived. They could run on balanced budgets because they got the subsidies from America's expansionary policies. So there's no easy answer there, but here's what I would say. I think it is important to remember that whatever particular decisions you make about the Greek issue or anything else, whether you like it or not, you're going to be affected by what happens in the rest of Europe. You're going to be affected by what happens in the rest of the world. And over the long run, cooperation always beats conflict, and big always beats small. Always. And so, but I think the first thing you have to do is let the people who are resistant to these solidarity measures know that there are real reasons that they're feeling this way. We got a former commander of your armed forces here. You know what? One of the things that you try to do with a new recruit is to give that young man or woman self-confidence, the sense that they're in control of their destiny, but that their fate, whether they live or die, depends on the strength of the unit. But in order to do that, you got to trust everybody else in the unit. So you need more self-confidence and more trust. That's what I would do. I would just work on it, and I wouldn't overreact to this, but I would stand up for solidarity. Over the long run, it's a winner. We have no choice but to widen the circle of our sense of community. That's how humanity has survived. You think about it, when the first family units were formed, when the first clans were formed, the first time people began to bump into people who were different from them, and they really had to worry about whether there was enough food for everybody. In the pre-literate, prehistoric era, they'd fight and kill each other, and then eventually they decided if they'd stop doing that and find a way to work together, they'd be better off. This is the whole story of human history. And at every period of insecurity, people want to withdraw. You have to fight it. And you're in a good position to do it.
Okay, Mr. President, thank you very much. Thank you.